In this final video on camera types, we're going to talk about the DSLR category of cameras. And to be honest, if you do photography for any length of time, you'll probably end up with one of these guys. Yes, they're the most expensive, but they're also the highest quality type of camera and they give you the most control. So here we're going to learn what a DSLR is exactly and how it differs from the other categories. We'll learn about the advantages and disadvantages of this type of camera, as we've done in the previous videos. And we'll learn how to get the most out of your DSLR. And I'll conclude with a few final recommendations on which categories of cameras you might want to use to get the most out of food photography. So what is a DSLR? How do these categories of camera differ from the others? And first, what does DSLR even mean? DSLR is a really long and confusing acronym for Digital Single Lens Reflex. And I'm not even going to go into what that means, except that it's digital and it only has one lens, which pretty much covers all categories of cameras. So the acronym is a little bit confusing. Another unique aspect of these cameras is that they have interchangeable lenses. So you can buy a long telephoto lens, you can buy a short lens, you can buy different types of lenses that are usually very expensive, but they give you a lot more flexibility. Perhaps most importantly about this category is that they have much larger and better quality sensors that gather more light and produce crisper, more accurate images. And because of that, they're definitely the highest quality category of cameras. Comparing apples to apples, you're going to get a much more high quality image with a DSLR than a point and shoot. So the advantages of DSLR photography is that you have complete control over every setting. You can control the ISO, you can control the aperture, you can control the shutter speed, you can control the white balance. Everything you want to do to your pictures is right there for you to control. They also, again, have top quality lenses and sensors that create crisp images with less noise, less distortion, and much more realistic representations of what you're looking at. It's never a good idea to take pictures in very low light, but if you have to, these cameras offer you the most flexibility because, again, they have larger sensors that gather more light, so it makes sense that they're going to take better pictures. They also shoot in the raw image format, which gives you much more control. Now, what we're talking about here is the digital file that you upload to your computer. Most lower quality cameras shoot in JPEGs, and those are the same type of image files that you'll see on the internet or other places, and they can be high quality, but they're flat, essentially. But a raw image is kind of like a digital negative. It gives you a lot of control, so you can adjust the white balance after you take the picture. It gives you a higher quality image that can be adjusted in many more ways than a JPEG, which is pretty much static and unchangeable. But even so, they often require much less editing. Remember in the point and shoot video, I talked about how I often had to spend 2 hours editing pictures in Photoshop just to get them to look real and undistorted. But on a DSLR, they're more likely to look realistic and natural automatically without much adjustments at all. But there are 3 disadvantages to DSLR photography. The first is the cost. You're getting much better pictures, but you're paying for it. At a minimum, it's going to cost $600 for an entry-level DSLR. They can get a lot more expensive, and some of the lenses can even be $1,000 or more if you wanted to get extra lenses. They're also complex and difficult to learn for a beginner. You'll likely need to take a course or get a more detailed book or manual that shows you how to use all your functions to get the most out of it. The final disadvantage is that they are a lot larger than point-and-shoot cameras. They certainly don't fit in your pocket, and you'll usually have to carry them around your neck, and they look a little bit clunky, and they're a little less portable than other types of cameras. If you decide that you'd like to use a DSLR to take food pictures, when would it be most appropriate to use this camera versus the other categories? And there's a few reasons. The first is when price is not a limiting factor. Because if you can afford a more expensive camera, you are going to get better pictures. So if you can spend a little extra, then it makes sense to use a DSLR. And as I said, they do have a difficult learning curve. So it'll take some time and some effort and some commitment to learning all the settings. So it's a good idea to use a DSLR only if you're willing to put in the time to understand the features. Otherwise, you just have a much more expensive point-and-shoot camera. And finally, it's important to use a DSLR when you want to take really high-quality images that are going to be displayed online in high quality, or you're going to print them, or other situations for maybe more professional uses where you really need quality images. In those cases, a point-and-shoot and a mobile phone certainly won't cut it. Getting the most from your DSLR really revolves around making sure you understand how to use all the settings. The higher quality sensors and the higher quality lenses are automatically going to give you better pictures, but for you to get the most out of it, you need to understand how to use it. And it's also important that you use quality lenses. There's cheaper lenses and there's more expensive lenses. And the more expensive ones generally offer you a more accurate and undistorted picture quality that can actually make a big difference. A lot of times people will recommend getting a cheaper DSLR and a more expensive lens. For example, if you have $1,000 to spend, don't buy a $900 camera and a $100 lens. Buy a $600 camera and a $400 lens, and you're actually going to take better pictures. And at the end of the day, the quality of the lens is probably on par or even greater in importance than the quality of the DSLR. So as you start learning about DSLRs, definitely make sure you don't skip over the quality of your lens. And finally, most DSLRs let you shoot in JPEG or RAW. And as we discussed briefly, shooting in RAW format basically gives you a digital negative that you can control much more efficiently. And if you didn't completely get that part, we'll talk again about RAW versus JPEG when we move into the editing section of this course. So if you haven't already, this is the point where you decide which cameras you want to use and which ones might not work as well for you. Personally, I use my mobile phone occasionally. I have an older point-and-shoot camera that I've talked about previously that I used to use, and most of my pictures these days are taken on a Canon Rebel T5i, which is not a very expensive DSLR. They're about $700 or $800, and I just use the lens that came with the camera, which is called a kit lens, and it works really well for my purposes. So most of my shots are on the DSLR, and I occasionally use the other two. So for you, what would I recommend? Ultimately, it's a personal decision depending on what your needs are, what your goals are, and what your budget looks like. But to give you the most flexibility, I would start with a base of a high-quality camera phone that you can use for unscheduled photo shoots, or you can use it at home if you don't have another camera. So that's where I would start with as a beginning. From there, I would decide if I have the interest and budget to buy a DSLR. How serious am I about photography, and do I want to make the investment in a more expensive camera that will give me more functionality? If I do decide that I want a DSLR, I would probably start with an entry-level camera, maybe $700 or so. A Canon or Nikon would be great, and then I would spend at least $200 on a 50mm prime lens. We've talked about the importance of lenses, and going into too much detail is kind of beyond the scope of this lecture. But a 50mm prime lens, 50mm means it's zoomed in slightly, so that's the focal length. And that's the kind of the perfect distance for food photography. Usually they have wide aperture so you can control the depth of field. They have very little distortion and give you really natural looking pictures. So 50mm seems to be the standard for food photography, and that's the lens I would start out with. So on the base of the iPhone, I would add a DSLR if I can afford it and if I'm going to use it. If not, I would buy a good quality point-and-shoot camera that has really good reviews. There's a million options for point-and-shoot cameras, so find one that fits your budget and that you're comfortable with if you can't afford a DSLR. So personally, I would have an iPhone and either a DSLR or a point-and-shoot depending on my needs and my interests. The iPhone camera is great, and if that's all you can use, then use it and you'll get some really good pictures if you follow the other advice in this course. But if you can afford it and you do have the interest, it would be good to either add a DSLR or a point-and-shoot camera to your collection for the best results. If you aren't using a DSLR camera, there's no homework for this lesson. If you are, learn how to use it efficiently. This probably means more than just reading the manual and practicing for a few minutes. It's probably good to get a little bit of outside instruction. You could pick up a book or take one of the great courses on DSLRs that they have here on Udemy to learn some of the more technical aspects of DSLR photography and to get really comfortable with your camera.